public policy. You are most welcome to this webinar on strategic leadership in the time of COVID-19 with General David Petraeus. It's part of a series on COVID-19 and early lessons from the pandemic that we are organizing together with the School of Public Policy. COVID-19 has presented leaders with the challenge of a generation. It's probably fair to say that not all leaders have come out equally well out of this test. And we thought it would be useful to take a step back and see what leadership entails and what it might imply in the current crisis. What are the tools a leader needs, and how can you teach those tools? We thought that perhaps a military perspective would be an interesting place to start. We are at war with an invisible enemy. Men and women on the front line are sacrificing themselves in the battle against the virus. We ask to come together and support our troops and so on. But are these really the right terms to use to think about this particular challenge? Are these the right way to motivate people? For one, we are trying to save lives, not kill one another. We want to bring countries together rather than pit them against each other. It could be that we also are looking at the wrong aspects of military experience for lessons. Military thinking has gone through radical change since the wars of the 20th century. We have with us here today one of the most experienced military commanders, General David Petraeus. He's been part of rethinking war in the US military and how to conduct military operations and what warfare means in different contexts. He served in many different roles in many different theaters, but of course he's most known for his role as commander in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also served as director of Central Intelligence Agency during the Obama administration. These days he is a partner at the KKR and head of the KKR Global Institute. And he's also associated with the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. Most welcome, General Petraeus. We are greatly honored to have you here. We also have with us Professor Michael Barzelay, professor at the LSE in the management department. He's worked extensively on public management, public policy, and change. He's analyzed strategic leadership also in military organizations. We're very glad that Michael has agreed to be part of today's conversation. He will make some comments after General Petraeus has had a chance to share his thoughts. We've also asked Dr. Shirley Yu, as Senior Visiting Fellow in the Institute of Global Affairs, to help lead the conversation. She has a long career behind her as an anchor woman on Chinese television, and she's one of the most frequent commentators on Chinese and global affairs on the BBC and other international media. Thank you for agreeing to moderate today's conversation. Before I hand over to Shirley, I just wanted to say that we will leave ample room for questions and answers after the discussion within the panel. We have a very large audience, both on this webinar and on Facebook. For those of you participating in the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll also try to monitor questions from the comment function on Facebook. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation when asking questions and keep them short. We'll try to keep track of all this, but please bear with us as we have a very, very large audience. Without further ado, I hand this over to you, Shirley, please.
Thank you very much, Erik. General Petraeus, you served closely President Bush 43 and President Barack Obama, and since then you have found a bigger calling to serve President of KKR, Harry Kravis, and now I finally understand why capitalism always wins in the end. We are really indeed greatly honored to have you here at the LSE. You are considered one of the greatest military generals of the 21st century. Vice President Mike Pence called you an American hero, and I want to ask you today what President Trump actually thinks of your Washington Post article. So tell us, what is leadership to you?
Well, thanks very much, Shirley, and thanks, Erik, for the kind introduction and the kind invitation to be with LSE. It's my first event ever with LSE, despite a lot of activities with a variety of different universities in the UK. Somebody described to me one time, leadership is the art of imposing your will on an organization. And there may be some elements to that. There are times when you do have to drive a campaign where you are, in a sense, imposing one's intellectual thinking on an organization to get it to move in the right direction. But I prefer a description of leadership that is more one of setting the conditions for each of those who reports directly to you and to the organization overall, so that it can be all that it can be. They can be all that they can be. This is an old Army slogan, in fact, for recruiting. And I think that's the proper perspective. And I think that's also has a huge insight about leadership style, which is that it can't be the same for every organization that you lead over the years. It varies dramatically. If you're leading as a young airborne lieutenant leading a hardcore airborne platoon, it's a very visceral, very follow me, very cheerleading kind of approach, as opposed to leading a huge multinational coalition or indeed the CIA. And so I think you have to be very sensitive again to how do I bring the best out in the organization collectively and in each of the individuals I'm privileged to oversee directly as well. But as you know, my focus really has been on a subset of leadership that is strategic leadership. And this is, I think, has its own unique tasks. Certainly all leaders perform these tasks, but it's only the strategic leader, or if there are co-heads, as in the firm I'm privileged to be a partner in, individuals that are picking the way forward. These are the individuals that are determining the strategy. In the case of, say, the surge in Iraq, I was the strategic military leader. Ambassador Crocker was the strategic diplomatic leader. And there are 4 tasks that a strategic leader has to get right. The first is to get the big ideas right, to get the strategy right. And by the way, if you don't get that right, all the rest doesn't matter. You can be the most inspirational, charismatic, energetic, focused, hardworking, and everything else. But if you do not have the right big ideas, if your strategy is wrong, you are not going to succeed. The organization will not succeed. And keep in mind, for example, in the surge in Iraq, the big ideas were 180 degrees different from what it was that we were doing prior to the surge. Then the second task is you have to communicate the big ideas through the breadth and depth of the organization. If you're a startup leader, that could be as few people as those that sit around a conference room table. And I'm also a private venture capitalist and have done drills with small elements, again, of startups where everybody in the room is the startup. If you have 165,000 American men and women in uniform and tens of thousands of other coalition members, and even your host nation partners, leaders above you and around you, that takes a good bit more. So that's the second task. And then the third task is what we normally associate with leadership. These are all the functions. This is the overseeing the implementation of the big ideas. This is providing the example, the energy, the inspiration, the drive, the determination, determining the metrics, ensuring that they really are rigorous, determining how you spend your own time. We called it a battle rhythm when I was in uniform. It was very, very intricate, in some cases 10, 15-minute intervals. And it showed what we did every single day, every few times a week, couple times a week, once a week, bi-weekly, monthly, all the way up to the 6-hour quarterly civilian military plan review that Ambassador Crocker and I co-hosted together. So that's another aspect of this as well. And again, that's a lot of what we normally think of. It's the hiring of good people, attracting them, keeping them. It's allowing those that aren't measuring up to move on to something else, and so forth. And then there's a fourth task that is often overlooked. This is something that I believe has to be performed formally. It should be on your battle rhythm in a variety of different ways. We had an hour on there once a month for one particular group of individuals. This was the colonels who headed all the different lessons learned organizations that were all over the battlefields in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. But you do it with your planners, you do it with others. And so again, it almost forces you, in fact, it becomes an action forcing mechanism for you to determine how the big ideas need to be refined so that you can do it again and again and again. And keep in mind the importance of that fourth task when you think about Kodak, which had apparently 2,000 or more patents on digital photography but didn't recognize the need to move rapidly in that direction. Others beat them to that, and they've never been the same ever since. So getting those 4 tasks, performing them correctly, is the art of strategic leadership. But again, it begins with getting the big ideas right, without which everything else is futile. And that is normally done, and there are subtasks for each of these. That one, the subtask is generally that it is done iteratively, because we don't get hit on the head by Newton's apple fully formed. If you sit under the right tree, you get hit on the head by a seed or a kernel of a big idea, and you shape it through conversation that should be as inclusive and open and transparent, and again, very iterative, because no one of us is smarter than all of us together. So that particular subset of leadership, again, strategic leadership, I think is truly crucial for organizations, for countries, for military units, for Alibaba with Jack Ma, a great strategic leader. Reed Hastings of Netflix, again, another one. All of these, when you see an organization that is changing, Netflix has reinvented itself at least 4 times. Think of Amazon and Jeff Bezos, how they continued shaping of new big ideas, refining of the old ones as you move from one use case to another. That is really, truly extraordinary strategic leadership.
So many can be leaders, but fewer can be strategic. I wish Greta Thunberg is tuning into your session today. So you talk about the big ideas, General Petraeus. Larry Summers recently said at an LSE event, actually, this level of global pandemic might occur from here on once every decade or so, rather than once every century, due to the rapid urbanization across Asia Pacific. So do countries just wait for another wave of pandemic to hit every decade or so? We just tough it out and we shut down the economies and universities? Is that the big idea?
No, I think the big idea is to have the big ideas in mind before you get hit. The biggest of the big ideas should be to constantly anticipate, to be looking out there in the minute that there is a sign of something that could become a global pandemic. Immediately, you ensure that you have the right testing regime, you activate that capability, you dramatically increase it. You revitalize your contact tracing capabilities so that when you identify individuals who are positive, you can immediately determine who they came into contact with. You have regimes for selective isolation of these individuals so that, again, when one pops up in Seattle, you immediately track, trace, and selectively isolate so that it doesn't continue to infect it, especially when it becomes community transmission. So that, again, the big idea is prevent community transmission almost at all cost. If you have community transmission, as clearly has been the case in so many countries in the world, and certainly in the United States, with New York City being the epicenter of this for sure. But when that happens, then you've just got to shut everything down. You have no choice, I think, but to reduce social contact to the greatest extent possible. You implement a variety of other measures, such as the wear of masks, physical distancing, teleworking for anybody who possibly can, complete isolation to the best of your ability for those who are the most at risk for this, the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, and so forth. And again, you have massive testing, contact tracing, and then selective isolation regimes. And for what it's worth, those big ideas largely have been agreed in the guidelines put out by the White House in the United States, Harvard Safra Center, AEI. There's a whole series of these. They're all generally the same, and they all recognize that, again, if you have community transmission, you have to stop it by shutting down.
Right.
And only when you have 14 days of downward trajectory in the metrics that show the infection numbers can you consider starting to reduce restrictions while still having masks worn in public, still
Right.
teleworking for those who can, still isolating those who are the most at risk, and really, if and only if you've got a massive testing capacity, contact tracing, and then selective isolation procedures. And that is crucial. And I don't think, frankly, that we still have the sufficient numbers in the United States. And I think that President Trump is going to address that in a press conference this afternoon at the White House.
Well, leadership is always tested by the unexpected. Speaking of which, you commanded 140,000 coalition forces during the surge in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. And the current—
it was a few more than that. It was about, I mean, we had 165,000 Americans in
Okay, so
uniform
much more
alone,
than that.
another
Right.
170,000 contractors, and probably 20 to 30,000 coalition, and then hundreds of thousands of Iraqi partners as well. So that was a very large organization.
So the current COVID-19 death toll globally, I should say, General Petraeus, is almost talking about it, almost equivalent to wiping out all the troops that you were talking about that were stationed in Iraq at the time. So you certainly could not have survived this sort of death tolls as the commander in Iraq. And so this is a different scenario, of course, but how did you face the cameras at the time and convince the world that more people have died, but I'm still right?
Well, these are two very different situations. Certainly when it came to the surge in Iraq, when I went before Congress for my confirmation hearing before assuming the duties of multinational force Iraq commander, I told the senators and the Senate Armed Services Committee, this is going to get much harder before it gets easier. I laid out what our strategy was going to be. I explained the big ideas, the biggest of which was that we had to secure the people. The human terrain is a decisive terrain, and we can only do that by living with them. And for the previous year or more, we had gradually been withdrawing from Iraqi neighborhoods, handing off tasks to the Iraqi security forces. But tragically, there had been an incident in February 2006, the surge started about a year later, that set off a cycle of Sunni Shia sectarian violence that just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And it's just a downward spiral that, if it's not arrested, continues on down and was on the verge of a full-blown civil war. Keep in mind that the month before the surge began, there were 53 dead Iraqi civilian bodies due to violence in Baghdad alone, in the capital of the country. So this is completely out of control. That's above and beyond the casualties that our forces, Iraqi forces, and so forth were taking as well. So I explained the big ideas. We are going to have to live with the people to secure them. We're going to have to fight to get back into many of the neighborhoods in which there's clashing between Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Sunni insurgents, and then Shia militia and other forces. This is going to be very, very tough. It did get worse before it got better, but then within about 4 months, there started to be a significant downturn. And by the time that I went back with Ambassador Crocker to testify to various houses of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the US, we had a substantial downward trend. Virtually all of the metrics that we followed most, the really high profile attacks that in some days were killing 150 Iraqi civilians with suicide bombs in multiple markets, down considerably, civilian casualties down considerably, our casualties starting to come down. Most importantly, just sheer indicators of violence were down some 45% or so. So again, that was more than statistically significant. It demonstrated that the approach was working. And then that gave us, if you will, the additional support that was necessary to continue for the duration of the surge, which was another 12 months or so, by the end of which violence was down by 85%, and Iraq essentially had a whole new opportunity to pursue that hadn't been present clearly when they were on the verge of a civil war.
Right.
The current situation, I think, is very, very different in the sense this distinction of lives versus livelihoods, I think, is a little bit of a false choice. And the reason I say that is that those who say, okay, let's let up, we're destroying the economy, we have to get back to the economy, overlook the fact that you can reopen retail stores, you can allow people to go into restaurants again, you can open up the broad gamut, the hospitality industry, whatever. But unless the people have confidence, they are not going to resume most of the activities that they carried out before, which are the drivers of the economy, especially in the United States, which is some 75% driven by domestic consumption. So you have to have confidence the people have to have that, or again, it doesn't matter what's open, the economy is not going to come back. So in this case, I think that situation is a bit different than the case where you say, okay, we got to take some losses for a while, but then it's going to get better. Here, if you're taking losses, and especially if they're going up, confidence is going down, and you have got to deal with the health crisis before you can actually address the economic collapse. And that is a huge challenge, I recognize.
Right. So on that point, I suppose right now the next agenda for both the United States and the United Kingdom is to reopen the economy at some point. So if we shut the economy to save tens of thousands of lives, it's very well worth the effort. But if to save a couple of dozen lives, probably not. I'm sorry to say this, but governments make utilitarian trade-offs all the time. But it's a huge gamble for political leaders. How do you time this decision?
Well, I think, again, the big ideas actually are quite clear. After months of experience, the various authorities, again, within the government, in the form of the White House guidelines, in the scientific world, the National Governors Association has a very good study that their experts put together, and all of these agree that until you have the downward trend, you should not relax restrictions. Now, we certainly have some states and municipalities in the US that are doing that. They are continuing some of the safeguards, to be sure, but I fear that that could prove premature. And what you will have then is not the kind of recovery that you're hoping for. And by the way, keep in mind, this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It's not bouncing back that quickly. I think now people can see that, but that was the expectation early on. At best, it's going to be a U, or an elongated U. You want to have that as vertical as possible, but I would contend that without confidence among the citizenry, you won't have that. The worst would be a W, where you have actually recovered somewhat, and then there is either some kind of new infection, or it bounces back from some other area as we let our guard down. It mutates. Again, these are the challenges, and they are very different, very difficult choices, to be sure, except that, again, I don't necessarily agree that you're going to sacrifice a few thousand lives for the economy, because if that happens, the economy will not come back. This is not a case of saying, okay, we got to fight our way into the neighborhoods. This is going to be tough. We're going to take some casualties, but it'll be worth it. And we'll see the benefits of that very quickly. In this case, I think if you take casualties, further casualties, you lose confidence. And that's really the essence of the recovery in all of our countries. And for what it's worth, it's a bit worrisome to see South Korea, which is doing such a fantastic job, had a super spreader in a bar when they reopened. I think it was this past weekend. And all of a sudden, again, there are hundreds of individuals. Even in Wuhan, they've actually had a little outbreak again. So this is going to be very, very tough. And without the massive testing regime, without the contact tracing, and without perhaps at some point some kind of digital credential that we all carry that is linked to the last test that we took, and those tests become so ubiquitous that you can do it every 24 hours or every hour or whatever it is. We'll see what science can do, but that's going to be required, I think.
Absolutely. I noticed that we have more and more people joining us now, and I wanted to ask you some bigger questions. Now, you commended the multinational forces from over 60 countries during the surge, and at one point in time, you did mention that you actually had to threaten, I think, using an inappropriate word, Prime Minister Maliki to bend in your way, actually a 180 degrees bend. And so if you were the commander of this multinational effort against the COVID-19 now, how would you make two of the world's most powerful leaders to stop attacking each other?
Well, first of all, if I could just make sure that there's not a misimpression by what you just said. First of all, actually, the coalition that was over 60 countries was actually in Afghanistan. In Iraq, I think we had 20 plus or 30 plus, something like that. Second, you don't threaten elected leaders and survive to tell about it. That is what's called non-biodegradable. It never goes away. Certainly, you try to convince leaders you're supporting, whose countries you are helping to combat terrible violence and so forth. And sometimes these have to be with issues that for which they don't have it initially, at least, a real confidence or enthusiasm. Reconciliation in Iraq, for example, I mean, the next big idea beyond we have to live with the people to secure them, the next one was that you can't kill or capture your way out of industrial strength insurgency. You have to reconcile with as many of the rank and file of the enemy as you can. This meant the Sunni insurgents and also the Shia militia, while you even more relentlessly go after the irreconcilables with our special mission units. Again, Delta SEAL Team 622 SAS was part of that, and so forth. So that's the way that you go about this. And again, reconciliation for a Shia majority country led by, understandably, a Shia prime minister with Sunni insurgents who have been going after the Shia population, that causes some reservations, and understandably so. It's one thing to do that out in Anbar province, let's say, where, again, it's all 99% Sunni Arab. It's very different when you're in mixed neighborhoods in a city of 7+ million people in Baghdad. And we had to very carefully work our way through that to establish the intellectual foundation for that big idea, to demonstrate the implementation of it would be absolutely fair and equitable, and all the rest of that. And over time, and with help from our Iraqi partners, we had a superb Iraqi point person for that. Dr. Bassema was a brilliant woman on that particular effort and was one of the prime minister's advisors on reconciliation. We did move forward. So that's what you do. Now you're asking, how do we get the two most important global leaders to work together to develop a global solution to what clearly is a global pandemic and now an accompanying global economic collapse? And again, one would hope that there is a recognition that, at some point, okay, let's stop the recriminations for a period of time, at least until this is all over, and then we can go back and do the after action review and finally understand what really took place in the beginning and where it began and how it got out, all the rest of this. That's for later on, I think. Right now, the imperative clearly is for the leaders of the two most important countries in the world, without whose leadership there will not be a global approach to a global problem. But keep in mind, the imperative here is recognition. There's a huge, big idea, and that is that no one of us is safe unless all of us are safe. This is, again, a global threat, and as long as it exists somewhere in the world, and that somewhere can get back into our societies, which is very, very difficult to prevent, unless you can do that, again, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. All of us, any man's death diminisheth me, as John Donne wrote. And this is one of those situations, very, very clearly. So again, my hope would be that there are those around the leaders who are advising, look, I know we're in an election year. I know this is a fragile time domestically, whatever. We've got to come together for the good of the world and for the good of our two countries. This is a case, I mean, if you believe in America first, you got to have the whole globe, because America first will be America alone if you don't have a global response. So I think that has to be the logic in this particular case.
Absolutely. Talking about America first, you have an opportunity, General, today to convince our European allies on NATO solidarity. Does Europe still have America's unwavering commitment?
Yeah, I think this is one of those cases where, as I have sometimes offered, certainly, listen to the press conferences, read the tweets, whatever, but follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. And if you look at where NATO is now, several years, 3.5 years into this administration, after several years of very robust support for NATO in the previous and the administration before that, you'll see that there is a U.S. armor brigade back on European soil for the first time in a number of years. You'll see that there are NATO forces, including U.S., but also UK, Canada, and I think Germany and others in the Baltic states for the first time. There are, again, NATO forces in Eastern Poland. There are U.S. aircraft out there. There are two new NATO command headquarters, which are established. One is a logistical command to push forces out to Eastern Europe, should that be necessary in the event of a threat out there. And the other is for maritime approaches to Europe, something that used to exist during the Cold War, but then went away and now has come back. Let's also recognize, in all honesty, the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War is Vladimir Putin and his invasion of the southeastern part of Ukraine, occupation of Crimea, South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, threats to the Baltic states, dangerous maneuvers at sea and in the air, and all the rest of this. And this, in a way, NATO has an important new reason to live, if you will, and it is the threat that has been posed by Vladimir Putin. Probably diminished now with the collapse of the price of Brent crude, the reduction of natural gas prices, which are the source of much of the revenue for Russia. Also, the sanctions that have been imposed on it are very difficult. And indeed, Europe has come together for that. And keep in mind that those sanctions were led by the leader of the country that suffered most because it had the most trade with Russia, and that was Germany. The chancellor was very, very strong on this and remains so. So, I think very much. Now, does that mean that European countries should spend the 2% of GDP? By no, they have to. And again, Germany just announced the other day 10% increase in its defense spending. Not yet 2%. It should get to that, which the leaders of the NATO countries agreed at a summit in Wales several years back. But again, I think NATO has done well. The challenge now, as the challenge for many different programs that governments pursue, will be the amount of fiscal debt that is being accumulated very, very rapidly. Keep in mind that in the United States, for example, we have taken on nearly 3 times our annual discretionary budget. Keep in mind the biggest amount of the budget is non-discretionary. It's entitlement spending, social support funding, and so forth. But the discretionary part, the bulk of which, or the biggest part of which, is defense spending. It's about 1.2 trillion total defense spending this year, 740 billion. There's going to be enormous pressure, I assume, once this is all said and done. Once we get the economy back to a new normal, because there will be certain elements that will evolve, new ones will be pursued, and others are not going to come back perhaps as far as they were before. But there's going to be enormous pressure in the future because of the growth in the debt to GDP ratio, not just in the United States, but in a number of other countries as well.
Right. So the good news is that NATO is going to be here, and I think that'll hit LSE headline news sometime in the future, I think. Now, there's another important question. You taught a course in New York called the North American Decades, the decades that follow the American century and precede the Asian century. It's paradoxical to me because it seems that your entire life has been devoted to defending the longevity of the American century. Would any US president ever accept a scenario that the American century would cede?
Well, I don't think it's something the president accepts or declines. I think it's reality. The world evolves. You have the rise of new powers. I mean, the rise over the last 41 years of the Chinese economy has been unprecedented. And by the way, I should note that the course title, first it was the Coming North American Decades. Then I figured they'd arrived. I taught this for 3.5 years or so at the City University of New York Honor College. It was a result of a question, in fact, at the Guildhall in London for some conference where they said, well, General, what comes after the what comes after the American century? And they expected me, I think, to say, well, the Asian century. And I said the North American decades. And the number of decades, if there are multiple, will be determined by how well the US and the other 2 economies of North America do in capitalizing on 4 great revolutions. And we spent our time focused on how to, with policies, promote and capitalize on the opportunities of the IT revolution, the manufacturing revolution, the life sciences revolution, and the energy revolution. And it was a great, fun course. The students were all handpicked. They were all honors college to begin with and had to compete to be in it. and they would write papers on how the government could make changes, again, to enable, to make the most of these opportunities. Two of those papers were so good. The students wrote as if they were the heads of departments or agencies in the government to the White House Chief of Staff, which was a role I played for that exercise. Two of those were so good, I actually sent them to Dennis McDonough, the Chief of Staff of the White House, who actually applauded them. So it was a wonderful intellectual exercise. But yeah, I serving in uniform or in government for 38 and a half years, I didn't feel as if I was out there defending the empire or the American century or something like that. I felt like we were defending freedoms and rights and so forth that we hold dear in our democracy, as does the UK in its, and certainly trying to do the best for our country that we could. But paradoxically, again, I think you often do well individually when you are a great team player. And one of the, you were going to ask me later, I think at some point, what's my advice for future leaders? And, one of them is to be hugely, life is a competitive endeavor, get over it. You don't get a trophy just for showing up, you get one for excellence. You might as well recognize it and try to be excellent to the greatest extent that you possibly can. The gentleman's bee doesn't impress me much. Cadets at West Point who were too cool for school, sucked the life out of me. You've got to be ready for it. But you don't just compete to be the best individual, you often compete to be the best team player as well. And again, that's true, I think, of countries also. And again, often the best leader is the one that is galvanizing a common spirit, common objectives, common ends. And even when you have competition, clearly the US and China are in a strategic competition, that's reality. But we also have very large number of common objectives, not the least of which right now is to guide the development of a global solution, again, to a global pandemic.
Absolutely. So General Petraeus, talking about values, I know your father was a Dutch sea captain and your mother was a librarian, loving parents. And when you grew up, your nickname was Peaches?
That came from somebody. I was in a baseball game when I was 8 years old, and the announcer couldn't pronounce Petraeus, and so he just Peaches, and that sort of stuck. And my West Point classmates still call me that, despite reaching 4 stars and everything else.
So from that little Peaches, let's imagine to General David Petraeus, what were the most important qualities that made you?
Look, we're the product of our environments, of our parents, of our friends, of mentors. I was privileged to have an incredible number of great mentors over the years, and to learn about strategic leadership by watching at firsthand strategic leaders. I was the executive officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a couple of years, a speechwriter for the NATO commander, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, aide and executive officer, assistant executive officer for a chief of staff of the Army. And so you learn by watching, you learn certainly by doing, even if you're not quite a strategic leader, certainly you're still determining the big ideas for your organization within the big ideas established by the strategic leader. You read avidly. If you're fortunate enough to be in the military, the professional military education system has very sequential leadership development and education and training. And as I said, very fortunate to have some mentors over the years who expressed interest, and and I try to be a mentor myself. And as you think about it, the ones you most enjoy mentoring, I think, are perhaps number one, those who have a lot of promise. The second is they actually respond, and they send you an email when they don't actually need something. I'd love to see an email from one of those that, for years and years, and it says, "Hey, boss, don't need anything, just wanted to give you an update." That's a great mentee. And then when that individual says, "Hey, sir, I need a letter of recommendation, I'm trying to go to whatever," then you're delighted to do that. I still do numerous letters every single week.
So I'm sure all the LSE students are taking notes carefully now. So
they're probably trying to get my email address so they can.
Absolutely. So COVID-19 is not so bad after all. When universities are shut down, we actually managed to get General David Petraeus virtually with us, four-star general, former CIA director. Thank you, sir, for your lifetime service. And now please allow me to invite world-renowned scholar in management, LSE professor Michael Barzelay, to further comment.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you, General.
Okay, thank you. It's good to have you at the LSE. Maybe next time we can have you in person.
I hope so.
I kind of wanted to use this time to make sure that we didn't really miss anything from your framework, and to make sure that all of the comments in the light of the framework sort of came together, so that the principles of the framework and your comments about the time of COVID-19 fit together perfectly, and people could take that away. So, so we may kind of go over a little bit of the same ground, but much more closely in relationship to the framework. Now, as far as the framework of strategic leadership is concerned, it seems to me that while it applies probably to almost any endeavor, it's meant to apply specifically to something we could call campaigns. Okay? And there are campaigns come in a variety of types. You can think of electoral campaigns, for example, military campaigns. Shirley mentioned our students are working hard, and they're in campaigns to finish their academic work for the year. And anti-pandemic campaigns are a form of campaign. So, and my sense is that the framework, being about campaigns, is particularly in giving a framework of strategic leadership for a kind of campaign we're talking about now, the anti-pandemic campaign. And so the framework or the theory essentially focuses on what management experts have always called the management functions of an enterprise, in this case, the management functions of a campaign, one of which, of course, is planning. And that fits into the first of your 4 points on having the big idea and coming up with the strategy. And I was quite impressed in watching some of the videos about your framework, that you would point to the importance of asking the question, how is this going to end? And it seems like a very good planning question, not the usual one. And in part, it's not the usual one because usually often the question for planning is, what are we going to do? And that's a different question than how is this going to end, because the how are we going to end question is really about how is this going to work. And that's a big difference. In fact, the director of the Wellcome Trust in the UK on a Sunday TV show talking about the pandemic and being invited to criticize the government, declined to do so, but he did say it didn't really matter if in this particular attempt to deal with a pandemic, the government did more than it did last time. The important thing is to win against the virus. So it's about getting things accomplished, not just. So I'm just wondering if, in the light of the things you said earlier, what's the closest connection that we should have between the planning principle, that one should ask the question, how is this going to end, and the many thoughts that you've already shared with us today about how to rise to the challenge of this pandemic?
Well, when the military goes through the so-called military decision-making process, you spend a great deal of time on developing the mission statement. This sounds actually very easy. It's actually not very easy. In fact, I would argue that we have screwed it up at various times in some of the campaigns we were embarked on. In fact, I said publicly on a number of occasions that we didn't even get the inputs right in Afghanistan until late 2010. And by that, I meant the right tasks and purposes, and the purpose is what you want to achieve, how it's going to end, but then also the right big ideas as part of that, the right organizational architecture, the right number of troops, amount of money, the right leaders, the right preparation of the forces, all of these different elements that go into trying to make progress. Because those kinds of campaigns, you don't win or lose. I refuse to use the words victory or defeat. I would talk about we're either making progress or we are not. And that's what you want to focus on. So, I mean, again, you have metrics. Keep in mind, you get the big ideas right. You communicate them effectively. By the way, that's where the plan is actually communicated. So in the first week of the surge alone, I gave a speech right after taking the colors and giving them back to the sergeant major that said, we must secure the people. We can only do that by living with them. I then gathered the commanders who were all there for the change of command ceremony, said, guys, we're going back downtown. They said, okay, got it. Then changed the mission statement, transmitted that, then changed the base plan, which was about 15 to 20 pages. And then over a number of months, changed every one of the annexes, which are the subordinate elements, such as the train and equip mission for the Iraqi military, the Iraqi police, all these different ministries, in addition just to the clear, hold, and build, the actual military activities that we were undertaking as well. So that's the actual plan. And then in the oversight of the execution of the big ideas, that's where you develop metrics. And again, you live and die by metrics. So my father, again, not just a Dutch sea captain, but a stubborn, crusty old Dutch sea captain, which is, I think, what probably all of them are, knowing my Dutch forebears very well and having a lot of Dutch cousins and so forth. And it's an admirable quality, mind you. Again, when we use the term old country, it was an affectionate term, not as used by one of our defense secretaries a decade or more ago. But there's a focus there on results, and he'd say, results, boy. And again, he wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't interested in, yeah, but you either got an A or you didn't. You either won the game or you didn't. You either, again, won the race or you didn't. I mean, again, there it might be nice if you're in the top 3 or the top 10 or what have you. And obviously you have to judge it by, what you're expected to do, et cetera. But I think the metrics here are very straightforward. And this is why I spent a fair amount of time early on describing, again, those metrics that the experts believe should be the measures of merit. And in particular, the 14 down days of the trend of the infection numbers, without which you should not reopen. And you open at your peril if you do. And we're seeing a bit of that in places where there has been an opening that might have been premature. So again, those metrics are very, very clear, and we can follow those. If we had even more testing, we would do even better. And I will continually emphasize, as I already have repeatedly, the critical importance of massive testing. And again, eventually, I think we're going to get to some kind of ubiquitous test that, again, we'll be able to administer to ourselves, and will be tied to a digital app that will have a digital credential, without which we're not going to get on a plane or a train or public transit. It may be, again, this sounds a bit futuristic, but the Chinese have an app. It's red, amber, green. It's tied to people you came into contact with. Again, still experimental. And of course, they have an advantage in the way that they can conduct their governance and operations. We would have some privacy issues with some of that, perhaps, but maybe not. If that's the price of reopening the economy and getting your livelihood going again, getting your country back on track, it may be that it comes to that. So again, I think there are very, very clear metrics that are already developed. I recognize that there are some leaders in the United States that actually put these metrics out or put the framework out, and then are downplaying or perhaps even suggesting something contrary to some of the guidelines that they issued. But we'll see how that plays out. My suspicion is that it will not play out well, and the ones to watch are those that are actually focusing on these, like the governor of New York. You can say they might have started sooner there. He agrees with that. Look at the governor of California, governor of Washington, governor of Maryland, Ohio, I think, and some others. Again, these are bipartisan. These are not all Democrat. There are some Republicans in there. But following that and seeing what the numbers reflect, I think, is going to be very illuminating.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to another aspect of your framework, and that is, I think, corresponds to the fourth pillar of it, and that is making changes as you go along in the light of what you learn. And, clearly because you don't know everything that's going to happen before it happens, it's a very important aspect of a strategy that works for a campaign or anything else. The principle is easier said than used, presumably, and in particular because, once people are pointing in a certain direction and have certain expectations, changing them along the way may be difficult, and may even raise questions about the big idea along the way. So I'm just wondering, from your experience, what's the trickiest part of making changes? Not trickiest part of coming up with the changes, but trickiest part of making the changes work.
Well,
large
there are a
organization.
couple of challenges here. I think first is you have to recognize that organizations get into a certain routine, they develop a certain degree of momentum, inertia, whatever, and altering that. In other words, they're pursuing a certain strategy, and altering that can be challenging. There can be times where big ideas are resisted. I did not unveil the reconciliation idea until later on, because I knew that there would be battalion and brigade commanders who understandably would say, wait a second, hey boss, you want us to sit down across the table from people who have our blood on their hands and we're going to reconcile with them? And the answer was yes, but that's how you end these types of wars. But I had to convince, and in that case, it was very important. In fact, I stopped in London on the way to Iraq to take command of the surge. And among the requests I had of then Prime Minister Tony Blair was that he leave Lieutenant General Graham Lamb in place. I knew Graham from many different tours in different places. We chased terrorists together and war criminals in the Balkans. We were division commanders together in the outset in the surge. We were even in respective jobs in the US when we were not in Iraq that were very similar, developing the doctrine for counterinsurgency, how the training and education should be done to prepare forces for that. He was already the deputy commander, normally stayed only 6 months. He was about to come out. I said, I need him to stay longer. And it was because he and I had talked about reconciliation essentially that took place in Northern Ireland, and how he sat down across from, I think it was Martin McGuinness, who was one of the IRA leaders, I believe. And as he said, his guys were swinging pipes at my lads just 2 weeks ago, and here I was sitting down across the table, but this is how these things end. And I needed that experience. And then we had General McChrystal, the head of our counterterrorism. He had intel analysts we could use to support this effort. So you've got to pursue that kind of consensus building when it's not obvious that the big ideas are clearly right. So you've got to go through that kind of process. And again, that's the beginning big ideas. Task 1, task 2, communicate, 3, oversee. Task 4 is again to sit down again, normally formally, you have to force yourself to do this. Create action forcing mechanisms on your battle rhythm to force you to determine, to identify how to refine the big ideas, how to adopt some new ones. And this was a new one, and then do it again and again and again, noting that we had tried reconciliation before. It was very successful when I was a 2-star commander up in Mosul in the north, until the Iraqis in Baghdad killed the idea. It was tried in Anbar province, it was tried in Tal Afar, and there was in existence a beginning of that out in Anbar province once again that I knew about, that I intended to build on. But again, this is one where we were going to have to convince our own leaders that this was the right thing to do. They ultimately all embraced it and realized that this is how you reduce the numbers. We didn't just pay these guys off, by the way. In fact, we couldn't pay them for the first 3 or 4 months. But we convinced them that life would be better for them if they supported the new Iraq and us, rather than continuing to tacitly or actively support either Al-Qaeda or Sunni insurgents, or on the other hand, Shia. By the way, this was not a trivial task. It was 103,000 Iraqi men over time with whom we reconciled. And it was a huge element of the overarching strategy, the overarching big ideas that really were the surge that mattered most. It wasn't the extra forces, it was the surge of ideas.
I think that gives us a picture of how the critical features of a campaign can change, at least maybe not different from the original plan, but different from the perspective of those participating in its execution. I'm just wondering, because we're getting new messages from our governments about what stage of the campaign we're in, somewhat new ideas about what would be important to getting out of this. But a lot of the citizens are trying to figure out what it means and act responsibly in that context. And maybe you could just help us understand a little how you were able to get people closer to the ground, not only to accept this direction, but be able to contribute to it.
Well, certainly it involved, in a sense, convincing those all the way down in the chain of command that this was a wise approach and not nonsensical, or I hadn't lost my marbles in saying that, yes, we're going to sit down with people who used to be fighting us. This is, and I'm a student of history as well. And when we did the counterinsurgency field manual during the 15 months between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, we went back and looked at all the cases, again, in modern counterinsurgency, the French in Indochine, and also in Algeria, the Brits in Oman, Malaysia, US and Vietnam. There's a number of these different cases, and tried to distill as many general principles, noting that every situation is unique and that what works in Iraq doesn't work in Afghanistan because they're very, very different contextual circumstances. So that's important. Beyond that, I do think that, again, periodically, you do change your big ideas. And it just came into my head. Keynes, of course, famously said one time, when I get new facts, I change my mind. What do you do? So it's okay to change your mind. It's not, you don't have to be absolutely dogmatically adherent to the first big ideas that you had. But you should be explaining this, and this is crucial. And I would send letters to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, and civilians, in fact, of the multinational force Iraq, because we had thousands or tens of thousands of civilians as well, periodically. And I'd explain what I'm thinking and how we're going about this. But of course, before I've done this, I've gathered the 3-star operational commander, the 3-star counterterrorism, the 3-star train and equip, the 2-star division commanders. They're really the ground owners, if you will. There were, I think, 7 of them during the surge in Iraq. They then go back and explain it to their brigade commanders. Each of them had 3 to 5 maneuver commanders and a variety of others that were in support roles. They then do it with their battalion commanders, who do it with their company commanders, who do it with the platoon leaders, who do it with the squad leaders. And I literally put out myself counterinsurgency guidance. And I would revise it every few months and just hit the send key, and it would go out and everybody would print it. And the idea was to get it all the way down to soldier level. And it was a series of admonitions, such as secure and serve the people. And then you would explain, promote reconciliation, pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly. There were some really fun ones in there. There was one that was promote initiative. And then it explained, in the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. And again, I would put that out, in addition to, of course, the formal plans that we had, all of which had metrics associated with them. And you would meet, again, on your battle rhythm with the different people that owned these different programs that had the metrics, whether it was trained Iraqis, readiness of Iraqi units, equipment fill, all of it. There is a huge number of these. I mean, we would have a different set of metrics that we would look at each day of the week, in addition to the ones that every single day I looked at in the 7:30 a.m. battlefield update and analysis that started every day formally, having began a bit earlier with an intelligence book, peddling a life cycle, quick bite to eat, and so forth, before getting into that. And I mean, you know, we'd have Bridge Day, and this is because the insurgents have blown up all the bridges. We had Electrical Power Day. We had Oil Production Day because they'd blown up all the pipelines, they'd knocked down all the high tension wires. And you have to, you know, drive this campaign. And occasionally you show how important it is, such as I remember there was one particular electrical tower, we kept flying by it. It was when I was flying around in the helicopter going, when you'd go long distances, you'd get on that, or actually even on a fixed wing to go full north or south. But I'd see Tower 57, it's on its side. And I finally said in one of these morning updates, the next time that I see Tower 57, the division commander, the 2-star, needs to be standing on it with a wrench in his hand. I want that thing fixed. And, you know, whoa, okay. But that's how you drive a campaign. And again, we would do a 1-hour battlefield update and analysis. It was distributed by video conference all around the country. It was actually taped and then emailed to all the, so all the 2 and 3 stars were on that. And then all of my staff were on it. And then we would have the brigade commanders and battalion commanders who had access to secure internet could download it and watch it as well. And a lot of them did, where they'd type up the key notes. You know, this is what's on the boss's mind. That's how you drive a campaign. And what we should be doing in the US right now and in many other countries, someone's got to drive this campaign at a national level to get all of the resources that are necessary to increase testing to a massive level. Again, at least 5 million a day in the US, and we're only doing probably right now 300,000 or so per day. But again, if you think about what is necessary, and for what it's worth, if you look at the example set by the White House, they are testing every day. And that's how they caught a couple of the people that actually tested positive. They're now selectively isolated. But that's what we should be doing for any area where we suspect that there are individuals who have contracted the coronavirus.
Okay, thank you. I know we want to get to Q&A from the audience. As I was working through this, preparing today, I was trying to think of both analogies and disanalogies between the military setting within which you're pursuing the campaign and the situation in a anti-pandemic campaign. And the one thing that I came up with as a disanalogy was that the troops, in this case the civilians,
Right,
haven't been trained in the way that the military participants have been trained, and it could be, although we don't necessarily think about this way, that training helps you be adaptive. And so I was thinking, okay, well, what would be the analogy to training the civilian population in advance of being participants in their role in a anti-pandemic campaign? And though I'm too young to have experienced this personally, I am aware that of civil defense drills and routines that were, that are the experience of people perhaps even older than you. And I'm just thinking that the power of your framework, if you actually work through these analogies, is to identify things that don't fit, and then think hard of what would be the functional substitute.
sure.
And perhaps this idea of civil defense against future pandemic might be on the agenda. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope that we can nail this even further in the future.
Now back if I could, Michael, and first of all, thanks for the great questions. Look,
please.
Absolutely, the military sort of has an advantage. I mean, a commander can actually give an order and expect that most of the folks are going to obey it, to implement the direction that is given. Again, even there, I think if you're falling back on your command authority all the time, rather than on the persuasive powers of your ideas, that your ideas may not be. If you have to actually say, well, do it because I'm telling you to do it too often, that's probably not a good indicator. Clearly, when it comes to a national leader or a governor of a state in the United States convincing citizens Here, I think you have to be very persuasive. I think you have to lay out why it's in their self-interest, why it's in the interest of others about whom they presumably care. It's about being a good citizen. This is what you should do. Appeal to their sense of patriotism and again, of service to others. And by the way, there are huge examples of this emerging all over our country. I'm sure there as well. The compassion, the generosity, all of this, I think, comes out in tough times. Here, again, I think it is perhaps appropriate to think about some kind of almost national service that could actually be employed. And I believe very much in the power of national service. I just don't want the military to be a vehicle for that, because our job should be to train and equip forces to be ready to deter warfare, or if, God forbid, you have to fight it, then again, to do that. When it comes to national service, then what are the other opportunities? And I think the value of this is, again, people pull together, they work with others who are not like themselves. It may well be that some kind of contact tracing organization, some kind of testing regime, some kind of, I don't know, will the modern day air warden from the Blitz become the modern day supervisor of selective isolation of individuals who have tested positive, and they're there to check on them, to make sure they need anything, to educate them on the latest developments and all the rest of that. But again, clearly the challenge for a national or subnational leader is to persuade, because you just can't order. Now you can make a law, you can have the law enforcement indeed ensure that that is followed. But if you really think about most of what goes on in society is a result of people actually stopping at red lights just because they realize they should stop at red lights, not because they think there is a policeman standing around the corner, adhering to whatever it is, speed limits and all the rest of that, just because they realize they should be good, reasonably good citizens when it comes to this. And I think there are a lot of analogies here. And I think in a pandemic like this, you do have to galvanize the population. You do have to appeal to their sense, again, of citizenship and of support for others. And, you know, and wear a mask, not because for you, but for other people as well. So that kind of approach, I think, is very, very valid. I think it's called for in these times. And we've seen some governors in the United States do this very effectively, actually.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, General. I wanted to bring in some questions now. We have as you can imagine, with this size of audience, we have a very large number of questions. So I have one question that I think one can think of is there are several people who have raised this. I'm going to bring out one of them, which I think this is a question on how to, so you are working with leaders who may not necessarily be doing the right thing. And of course, as a general, you have to manage upwards as well. And you have to, so for example, this is from Gavin Charles, LSE alumnus currently working with the Canadian International Development Organization. So he asked, what are your thoughts of managing up? That's if there's a failure of strategic leadership at the top of a hierarchy. How can those below help to fill the gap? Imagine that you were in the place of Antonio Fauci in the US.
Well, obviously you try to employ your persuasive tools and arguments. You lay out the logic for taking a particular action. Look, I had to manage up most of my career. I mean, it was only in the surge in Iraq and the surge in Afghanistan, to a degree, Central Command, actually maybe as a 3-star in the United States, where we had this huge purview over the training, education, organization, and all the rest of this. But the rest of the time, there was somebody above me who was the strategic leader. They might leave a fair amount of latitude, but at the end of the day, again, you are trying to persuade your boss to do or allow you to do something, or in fact, ask him to do something. And again, it takes persuasion. You have to understand your boss. You have to understand what is it that can get his or her attention, what might be the persuasive approach that could be adopted. But you don't win all the time. There are numerous cases where I went in and argued for something as a battalion commander, brigade commander, division commander, what have you. And we didn't always look. When I was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the great 101st, and there will be some that will have noticed that I am conspicuously drinking from a 101st Airborne Division mug. This is the Screaming Eagle patch. Ambassador Bremer, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, took actions that cut our knees out from under us, which we sought to persuade him not to do. But firing the military without telling them what their future was. Again, you needed to do demobilization, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, the traditional tasks in post-conflict situations, especially if you have a huge sort of jobs program kind of military like Iraq had, especially jobs program for generals, I might add. But you don't fire them all and expect them to support you the next day. You've just created the seeds of the insurgency. And that was exactly what happened. When it came to de-Baathification without an agreed reconciliation, don't get me wrong. We needed to, and the guys at the top, the ones that were in the deck of cards, let's say, Uday and Qusay, Saddam's sons, number 2 and 3, we were proud to have brought them to justice. We wanted to have them surrender. They didn't. They shot back. They caused some casualties. And so we basically took the building down around them. And again, we would do that again. And the same for those that even the next level down. But when you get down to the level 4 level, this is tens of thousands of bureaucrats that we needed to run that country. Mosul University, for example, had 120 tenured professors who were Baath level 4 FERCA, and they were all cast off. And again, in that society, there's no private universities to which they can go get a job. They're finished. And so we got permission. I did ultimately get permission from Ambassador Bremer to have reconciliation in the 101st Airborne Division. It worked really well. It gave them new hope. It gave them a reason to support the new Iraq. Again, we had a sign on our operations wall of our operations center, and it asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And if the answer to that is no, you're supposed to go sit under a tree until the thought passes. That's what Ambassador Bremer should have done, because we created vastly more enemies than we took off the street by firing the military without telling them what their future was for 5 weeks. Finally, and in fact, I flew down and finally confronted the individual who was in charge of that policy and said, your policy is killing our troops. And finally, they decided on some kind of stipend program, but we had lost 5 weeks that we could never get back. And that really did in many ways sow what became ultimately an insurgency. And the same with the other members of the government, the level 4 in particular. And again, most of them, by the way, educated in the UK or the US. These are the ones that we wanted to help run the new Iraq. And instead they were cast on the ash heap of history, except for our reconciliation initiative, which we could only keep alive for about 5 or 6 months before those in Baghdad killed that. So look, you don't win them all. And we had some catastrophic setbacks as a result of not being able, or actually just having a decision made without our consultation, which is actually the case in those two. Although when we appealed it very quickly and could have retrieved something, there was no response until it was very clear how devastating an impact this had. So you do have to manage up. You do have to try to convince your boss of something if you firmly think that that's the right course to take and it's not being pursued. But you also have to recognize that you're not always going to get that. And by the way, in the military world, look, there's never been a general in history in combat who had enough troops, enough money, enough now bandwidth, high 25 megahertz TACSAT channels and unmanned aerial vehicles. So you're always trying to, again, get more, and you're trying to hang on to it as long as you can. But you're not going to be able to do that. You have to accept, again, that someone else is going to make a choice. And by the way, he or she has some other issues out there that aren't within your purview, but that are very real, and that could cause someone to make a decision that you would not recommend. And again, that's where you have to deal with that. I mean, if it's truly that significant, then of course, that's where I think you have to, if you're not taking my advice, boss, you didn't take it on that, you didn't take it on that, perhaps it's time for me to allow you to get somebody else whose advice you might follow.
Thank you. There are many questions on this issue that I actually brought up in my introduction was, your use of sort of war terminology. So that, for example, Chris Pook, who is a former British military who served 10 years in Afghanistan, I think, he said, calling this crisis a war helps to lionize politicians who want to be like wartime leaders and trivializes the depths of healthcare in wars. This is a healthcare emergency, and with the proper response and equipment, our doctors and nurses would not be dying. There are several questions in this. You did a lot to change thinking about how you fight a war. Are we using the right terminology even when we use these references?
Yeah,
from
I don't think it's unreasonable to liken this to a war. Let's keep in mind, as an example, in the United States, we have lost more Americans. We lost more in 1 month, the month of April, than we lost in the entire Vietnam War. And not only that, now we've lost more than all that we lost in Vietnam, plus both Iraq wars, Afghanistan, and the 9/11 attacks, and soon will be the Korean War, perhaps as well. So I don't think this is a horrific situation, and it is the unseen enemy. I don't think it's wrong to use the term enemy. And I would submit that those who are on the front lines, and I have recognized this in my social media, which is only on LinkedIn to be sure, but the front lines in this war are those who are in our healthcare system and those, the first responders, the police, the ambulance drivers. It's all of those that are supporting those efforts who are truly putting their lives on the line, in some cases without sufficient protective equipment, as was noted, and yet are still there because they feel the commitment, the importance of a mission that is larger than self. So I see a very distinct analogy. Now, it shouldn't be overused. I mean, it shouldn't be to cloak yourself in this and to be, I'm a wartime leader, and therefore, well, then you have to obviously meet the responsibilities of a wartime leader as well. But I don't think that, again, some of the approaches of, one of the greatest wartime leaders of all history, of Churchill, who both worked very hard to get the big ideas right, also to communicate them, to inspire, to give this sense of relentless determination. And again, I think truly an extraordinary leader in every single facet of this strategic leadership. Getting the big ideas right, communicating them effectively. Again, a masterful, eloquent, extraordinary speaker. His relentless oversight of them. I mean, he wasn't the easiest of guys to work for, obviously, and his own battle rhythm, which, as you know, sort of extended every day until the early hours of the next day, wore out a lot of his staff. But by golly, he was driving that campaign. And then, of course, this ever inquisitive mind that he had. Perhaps he had too many good ideas at times, but you listen to all the others, because in those are some real nuggets that indeed helped to turn the tide of a war that would have reshaped the world.
There are many questions also on the diversity of leadership, and you referenced some examples of women who had been very effective in your command. So, for example, Catherine Swartz is LSE alumna. We still have staggeringly low numbers of women and people of color in strategic leadership roles across government and industry, given that these people are often disproportionately negatively impacted by the crisis like COVID-19. how do we make sure their voices are represented in planning, managing responses, and recovery effort? Another number of other questions reference, the example set by some women leaders and so on. How do you think we would have had a different response had we had more women involved in the preparation and planning?
Yeah, I don't know whether it is as much gender that is what determines the effectiveness. I mean, you've seen arguably the single most effective leader in the pandemic is in fact the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she has been exemplary. She was also exemplary in the wake of that mass shooting, needless to say, and hugely impressive. Again, getting the big ideas right, communicating them, great communicator, relentless overseer of the campaign, and constantly determining how to tweak them, how to refine them. Now, it helps to be an island in a case like this. It helps to be able to, it's really hard. I mean, you really have to want to go to New Zealand if you're going to try to just go there some way other than flying, or a ship that is going to be official. But again, she has been exceptional. Chancellor of Germany has been exceptional. Again, but I'm sure there are probably some women who haven't been, just as there have been men who haven't been and some who have. So I don't know whether it's gender. I do think that I long felt in the US military that, look, it shouldn't be about gender. It should be about ability. And, if you can pass the physical fitness test to go to Ranger School, and they can make it all the way through Ranger School, and there's no reduction of standards in any way, assuming the standards all made sense to begin with, then, what is the big deal here? And lo and behold, we've had women in the United States go through Ranger School that basically have opened up virtually every opportunity in the military, keeping in mind that, of course, it was the military that was one of the first desegregated elements in the U.S. On a national basis, even when many of our military bases in the South still were surrounded by states that had segregation. So I think the military has long been a champion of this. It's always difficult. Look, you have it in the financial industry. And maybe there are some reasons for why that might be. Obviously, women have certain, if you will, responsibilities when it comes to giving birth that are tough to share, and so on. But at the end of the day, we've gone to great lengths at my firm. We actually we'll pay for a nanny to go with a new mother on a trip. There is parental leave for both, male as well as female. But that's what's necessary to, again, keep people. We had a very innovative approach at the CIA, which is about 45% women, I might add. And one reason for that is that when women had children and said, look, I just can't do the grinding hours that I normally do. I really want to raise my child at least to the point that he or she is eligible for the daycare. So we ran our own daycare center inside the compound of the CIA. And so we said, fine, look, we'll let you do, how about 20 hours a week, just so you can keep your clearance, keep your intellectual capital reasonably. So this will be a case where you are a net consumer rather than a net contributor, but that's okay, because when your child is ready for daycare, school, and you can devote more time, we'll allow that. And lo and behold, 10, 15 years later, when the child is off at college, this emerges as the director of the CIA, noting that we have the first female director now, and she is a professional. She's not a political appointee. She worked her way up within the ranks, and I, at one point, ensured that there was a step that she took that was critical in that regard. So, you have to take active steps to recruit people. And you've got to have people in your organization that others can look to and say, I'd like to be like that person. If you have no person of color or no women in your organization, who do they look to as an example? If you really think about, people ask me, why did I go to West Point? Well, gosh, I live 7 miles away. I delivered newspaper to people that were West Point graduates. My Sunday school teacher, the ski coach, all these were, and I could see cadets. I wanted to be like them. We have a saying in the United States, of course, I want to be like Mike. Of course, referring, I think, to Michael Jordan. And you know, I just wanted to be like Mike. In this case, it was cadets. Well, who can you say I want to be like Mike if Mike or Michelle or whatever does not exist in an organization? So you have to go out and get people who can then provide an example for those who might want to aspire, and they are the trailblazers. And this is why it is so important that we've recognized over the years the individuals that have literally done that. There was an African-American parachute unit, for example, we dedicated a monument to at the Command and General Staff College when I was a 3-star there. And as we said, they jumped into history for their race. They led their race again into the U.S. military in combat roles, not just as supply transport or what have you, which is what an awful lot of those in World War II were doing.
There are a number of questions that have to do with sort of, I guess, multiple missions. You are a commander and you have to both improve on climate change. How do you straddle different missions, and how are there ways in which you can use one mission to achieve the other mission? I said this is the question. Let me just.
I lost a little bit of that.
Because I want to reference.
You're breaking up a bit.
Yeah. So okay. So that's the question from Heidi Samso. She's a PhD at LSE. How do leaders effectively address the current crisis without taking away focus to tackle the even greater, deeper crisis of climate change? And it goes to this issue of, you know, having multiple missions. I mean,
at the end of the day, you've got to prioritize it now. But prioritization doesn't mean that everything you do is on this. You have to. I used to say, for example, people used to ask me, "What do you do as the U.S. commander of U.S. Central Command?" This is an area of responsibility: 21 countries from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, to Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia in the south. They said, "What in the world do you do?" And of course, we had the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, we had Yemen, we had terrorists all over the place, we had pirates, we had all kinds of challenges. We had 60 plus coalition members in one country, 30 or so in another. And I said, look, think of the commander of Central Command like the guy in the circus who keeps a plate spinning. You know, he gets a stick, he puts a plate on it, he gets it going, and that one's going. Then he runs over and he does another and gets that one going, and then he does another. Now, and he has got a lot of plates spinning. And the key is that you can't let the most important plates, the most important missions fall. They can't fall down and break. So some plates are much more important than others. And again, the pandemic clearly has to be the most important plate right now. Again, if we don't resolve the health crisis, we are not going to be able to resolve the economic crisis that is a result of it. But it doesn't mean that as you're keeping that one plate really spinning, that you can't address other missions. You can't keep other plates spinning, metaphorically speaking. And one of those certainly would be the climate issue. And of course, we've seen with this dramatically reduced amount of economic activity that how blue the sky is. And, you know, all of a sudden you can see the Himalayas from cities that used to be covered in smoke, et cetera, et cetera. That shouldn't mean that you shut down the economy to solve climate, because if you do that, obviously, so it's a matter of how can you get the economy going again, but do it in a much more intelligent and climate-friendly, environmentally friendly way. And hopefully during this time, we're not stopping work on those kinds of issues. Although I have some concerns with the reduction of the price in oil, whether the incentives for renewables and so forth, smart grid, et cetera, will be seen as important as they were before this all happened. But that's the function of leadership is not just to get the tasks and the purposes right for each of these different missions. It's to determine how to allocate resources to them. And by the way, keep in mind that strategic leaders in most cases are allocating shortages. Again, to give the example of U.S. Central Command, you have Iraq, they want all the unmanned aerial vehicles we have. Afghanistan wants its share. We got some stuff going on in Yemen. My gosh, their pirates just hijacked a ship, so you got to put some over there. Oh, by the way, don't forget about what's going on in the Gulf and Iran harassing shipping. You are always allocating shortages, but there has to be a main effort. It has to get the bulk. You've got to, again, resolve that one while still keeping these others going. And I think that's one of the challenges of leadership, is to ensure that the priorities are right and that they're then adhered to by everybody. Part of driving the campaign is to make sure not just the really visible resources are allocated properly, but it's all these other assets that are necessary for success in each one of these discrete missions, that they get their share of that, and that the one determined to be the main effort gets most of them, or gets the most of all of the others. But superpowers in particular can keep many plates spinning at a time, and that's exactly what we have to do.
So there have been many questions about, what are the qualities of a strategic leader, and one question, maybe as a final question, could be: does a strategic leader, does he need empathy, or she need empathy?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a quality. I think, again, that's over in, that's after you get the big ideas right. Although in many cases, if you have an inclusive, open, transparent, even empathetic, if you will, encouragement to all those in your organization to be engaged in the determination of the big ideas, I think that helps. The communication component, you want to communicate concern. That might be one of the big ideas, in fact. But it's over here in the overseeing the execution of the big ideas where I think that really comes through. And I can tell you, you have to be if you're a commander on a battlefield. Command Sergeant Major Marvin Hill, a great senior non-commissioned, senior enlisted advisor to me in 4 combat tours. He and I went to a lot of memorial ceremonies, and you put a lot of arms around a lot of shoulders, and it's okay for soldiers to hug one another, and it's okay to demonstrate emotion. I mean, you have to. Number one, you can't stop doing it to a degree. You have to show relentless determination. You've got to show drive. You've got to have energy. You've got to have encouragement. You do have to have empathy, and you have to understand. And by the way, for what it's worth, an awareness of the challenges of subordinate units is part of this as well. We literally had to move some units in Iraq because they were getting hammered so badly in the early months of the surge. The casualties were so high. I mean, there was one single infantry battalion, 3 weeks in a row, each week. The Sergeant Major and I went to memorial ceremonies in which they were honoring 5 or more soldiers killed in attacks, individual attacks during that particular week. So you have to understand that, and you have to appreciate the emotions. You have to appreciate what, again, combat does to individuals. It changes everybody. Trust me. I mean, this is a grinding, grueling experience, and you have to understand that. In fact, if you can't understand that, how in the world can you lift them up? How in the world can you share emotions with them? How can you give inspiration? How can you communicate that you actually understand what they're going through? It's one of the reasons that on that battle rhythm, twice a week minimum, right after that morning update I talked about, we would go and either get in an armored vehicle and drive downtown Baghdad, or a helicopter to go outside someplace further, or sometimes a fixed wing plane to go north or south. And there we would go on patrols with soldiers. Now, I don't want to, make this too heroic, like we're out there clearing and holding and engaging in a short range knife fight or something like that. But you're walking on patrols with them in tough areas, through markets that had been bombed a week earlier, through areas where snipers had killed our soldiers in previous days. And you have to do that. You have to share at least part of the risk and the hardship. You can't share it completely because you obviously have a whole different set of responsibilities and duties. but you do need to be seen. They need to see you and you need to see them. And they need to know that you appreciate the hardships they are enduring for a mission that we're all engaged in together. And you have to communicate your deep appreciation of what it is that they're doing. And that's exactly what national leaders and state leaders and so forth and municipal leaders have to do right now when it comes to those who are on the front lines of this current war, the pandemic, because they are sharing enormous risk and enormous hardship with their fellow members on the front lines. And we all need to recognize that. That is why at 7 p.m. every evening in New York City, everyone goes out and bangs pots and cheers and makes noise to show their appreciation for those who are indeed sacrificing for the greater good in the health clinics, in the first responder ranks, and so forth.
Well, thank you very much, General Petraeus. You have given us a glimpse into the thinking of strategic leadership that we very much appreciate, and also reminded us that we are talking about lives being put at risk and life being saved or life being lost. So that's a very important lesson when we talk in the abstract about strategic leadership, not to forget that. I think I want to thank also Professor Michael Barzelay for his remarks and for Shirley Yu for her moderation. And we very much hope that you will have a chance to come back in person to LSE and share more of your insights and experience. So thank you very much, and be safe, be careful.
Thank you, Erik, Michael, Shirley. I look forward to being there in person.
Thank you, General, and thank you for all who have tuned in.
Thank you very much.